There are seasons in your life when it looks like the pressure around you is growing stronger, when the whispers become more organized, the resistance more deliberate, and the opposition more strangely coordinated than coincidence should allow. But what you are witnessing now is not the strengthening of your enemies, it is the beginning of their collapse. Something shocking has already started behind the scenes, and the people, forces, and hidden agendas that once gathered to block you are stepping into a storm they created with their own hands. What they released toward you in secrecy is no longer staying aimed at you. God is exposing the architecture of the attack, and even more than that, He is causing the very energy they used against you to circle back into their own camp. The lies are losing direction, the alliances are losing peace, the masks are losing stability. What once looked like a united front is becoming a battlefield from within. And the reason this matters so deeply is because you need to understand that you were never simply under attack. You were being separated from what could not go where you are going. This is why you must not panic when you see strange reversals, unexpected exposure, or sudden confusion among those who once seemed powerful. Heaven is not absent in this hour. Heaven is active. And before we go further, take a moment to settle this in your spirit. If this message is already confirming something you have felt but could not explain, stay with it until the end, subscribe, and leave a sign of agreement in the comments. Because what is unfolding around you is not random chaos, it is divine reversal. The same hands that tried to bury your future are about to lose their grip on each other. And when this unraveling is complete, you will understand that God did not merely defend you, He turned the entire war inside out. What makes this season so intense is that the war against you did not begin in obvious places, under bright lights, or with clear warnings, but in hidden conversations, private resentment, silent jealousy, and carefully disguised hostility that grew in the dark while you were simply trying to survive, grow, and obey what God placed in your spirit. They gathered against you in secret because darkness always prefers agreement without exposure. Very few attacks against a chosen life begin with open confrontation. Most begin with suggestion, then exaggeration, then alliance. A thought is planted, a suspicion is shared, a wound is exploited, a narrative is repeated. Then, before long, several people who do not even fully trust each other begin cooperating simply because they share one thing in common: discomfort with your light. That discomfort can take many forms. Sometimes it is jealousy because your peace exposes their inner unrest. Sometimes it is insecurity because your growth reminds them of what they abandoned. Sometimes it is spiritual resistance because what you carry threatens the systems they depend on. Sometimes it is simple manipulation, the desire to keep you confused, delayed, under control, or emotionally exhausted so you never fully step into the authority that has been forming inside you. And what made their gathering feel so unsettling was not just the existence of opposition, but the calculated nature of it. It was the strange timing, the repeated misunderstandings, the way doors closed after certain conversations took place, the way you could sense coordinated energy even when there was no visible proof. This is one of the loneliest parts of a chosen path, because you often feel the weight of a pattern long before you can explain it. You know something is off. You know the resistance is not random. You know there are forces at work beneath the surface. But because the attack is subtle, relational, emotional, or spiritual, you are tempted at times to question your own discernment. That is part of the strategy. Hidden opposition always tries to make the target doubt what they feel. But your spirit recognized what your mind had not yet gathered into evidence. There really were people aligning in private, speaking in coded ways, reinforcing each other's narratives, strengthening one another's bitterness, and believing that their unity in darkness gave them power. That is how these enemies operated, not necessarily as grand villains in dramatic scenes, but as participants in a field of corruption, each bringing their own envy, pride, accusation, or deception into a shared atmosphere. They believed they were strong because they were many. They believed they were clever because they were hidden. They believed they could outlast you because they confused silence with weakness and delay with defeat. Yet what they did not understand is that secrecy is not strength when God is watching the entire structure form. In fact, one of the most dangerous illusions evil can possess is the belief that hidden agreement is permanent. Darkness can gather people quickly, but it cannot keep them whole for long. because the very qualities that unite them also poison them. Still, before that poison turns inward, there is often a painful period where you, the chosen one, must endure the effect of their cooperation. You may have felt isolated, blocked, misread, or strangely outnumbered. You may have wondered why certain attacks were allowed to intensify, why certain betrayals were not immediately stopped, why certain schemes seemed to advance farther than they should have been permitted to go. Yet that question leads to the next truth, and it is one of the hardest truths for a faithful soul to accept in real time. God allowed the plot to ripen, not because he approved of it, and not because he abandoned you, but because exposure is more complete when corruption is allowed to mature into full visibility. This is one of the deepest patterns in divine justice. God does not always interrupt wickedness at its first whisper. Sometimes he permits it to develop, so that every participant, motive, and hidden loyalty can reveal itself without excuse. What feels like delay to you is often disclosure in the spirit. The plot had to ripen because half-exposed evil will always try to rebrand itself as misunderstanding. But fully ripened evil exposes its own nature. That is why some of what you endured seemed to go on longer than your heart thought it could bear. You were not being forgotten. You were being positioned to witness the full anatomy of the attack. Every false smile had to speak long enough to expose itself. Every hidden agenda had to connect with the others long enough to show its pattern. Every disloyal heart had to choose its side without being forced. Because God was not merely dealing with actions, he was revealing character. This is why heaven often appears slower than human pain would prefer. We want immediate rescue, instant vindication, sudden intervention. But divine strategy often works on a deeper clock. God does not just stop a moment, he reveals a structure. He does not merely shield his chosen from the sting of betrayal. He uncovers the ecosystem that made betrayal possible. He lets the plot ripen, because premature interruption can leave hidden roots alive in the ground. And if those roots remain untouched, the same war will return in another form later. So what looked like silence from heaven was not absence. It was surveillance. It was permission for darkness to show its full face. It was mercy toward you in a form that did not feel merciful yet. Because when this process is complete, there will be no ambiguity left about who aligned against you, who watched silently, who profited from confusion, who fed the fire, and who remained clean. That kind of clarity is costly, but it is also freeing. It saves you from future entanglements. It saves you from misplacing trust. It saves you from carrying guilt for battles you did not create. Many chosen ones suffer not only because of opposition, but because they keep blaming themselves for the cruelty of others. Yet when God allows the plot to ripen, one of the greatest gifts he gives is unmistakable revelation. You stop wondering whether it was all in your head. You stop minimizing what your spirit felt. You stop trying to rescue the image of people who repeatedly chose darkness. And once the plot reaches that mature stage, something inevitable begins to happen inside the camp of the enemy, because evil can perform unity only for a season. After the hidden motives are fully grown, cracks begin to form in their alliance. This is where the atmosphere shifts in ways you can almost feel before you fully see them. The same people who once seemed coordinated begin to lose rhythm. Tension rises between them. Small slights suddenly matter. Hidden resentments that were tolerated while they were focused on you begin surfacing. Suspicion replaces trust, because darkness can cooperate, but it cannot truly commune. It cannot produce peace. It cannot hold loyalty for long, because each person in that alliance is still ruled by ego, insecurity, fear, or ambition. They may have joined hands around a shared target, but they never shared a healed nature. That is why the alliance begins to crack. One starts feeling used, another starts fearing exposure, another wants more control. Another realizes promises were never meant to be kept. The very people who once smiled at each other while discussing your downfall begin quietly questioning each other's motives. They start wondering who said what, who leaked what, who is becoming a liability, who might betray first. And this is where divine reversal becomes visible in the psychology of the enemy. The energy that once flowed outward toward you begins curling back inward. The unity weakens because it was never built on truth. It was built on strategy without love, on cooperation without trust, on common hatred without common healing. That kind of structure cannot survive pressure forever. The moment God withdraws even a small degree of restraint, the internal contradictions begin speaking louder than the external mission. Now their own personalities become the problem. Their own egos collide. Their own wounds start bleeding into the alliance. They no longer have the same patience for each other that they once had when you were the focus of their agreement. This is why you may begin to hear of strange disagreements, sudden distancing, exposed communications, broken loyalty, or emotional instability among those who once seemed so composed. The alliance is cracking because darkness is an expensive thing to maintain. It requires constant management, constant narrative control, constant blame shifting, constant suppression of truth. And once fatigue enters that system, the fractures widen quickly. This is the part where you must resist the temptation to intervene too early. When chosen ones begin to sense the enemy turning inward, there is often a human urge to step in, expose everyone, defend yourself, or force the collapse faster. But much of divine justice works best without your interference, because God wants the alliance to unravel by its own internal corruption. He wants the hidden rot to become undeniable. He wants each person's true nature to emerge, not under your accusation, but under the weight of their own spirit. There is a difference between revenge and revelation. Revenge tries to produce an outcome. Revelation lets truth expose itself. And in this hour, revelation is doing its work. The smiles are thinning, the certainty is weakening, the shared mission is losing glue. What once looked organized now begins trembling under the pressure of its own contradictions. But even that is not the deepest layer of what is happening, because the chaos now unfolding among them is not random personality conflict or unfortunate timing. It is the same spirit they used turning back on them. This is the law so many people ignore when they build their lives around sabotage, deceit, envy, or accusation. They imagine these forces can be directed outward without consequence, as though poison obeys intention and never touches the one carrying it. But spiritual reality does not work that way. What they released toward you became the atmosphere of their own inner world long before it became their outer downfall. Every lie they spoke trained them to distrust. Every accusation they crafted trained their hearts to expect accusation. Every act of sabotage made them more suspicious of sabotage. Every seed of envy made them more restless in the presence of anyone else's success. What they sent toward you did not remain a tool. It became their climate. This is why the same spirit they used now turns on them with such precision. Deceit breeds paranoia. Envy breeds bitterness. Manipulation breeds instability. Accusation breeds fear of exposure. Sabotage breeds mutual destruction. They were not merely performing these things against you. They were inhaling them, rehearsing them, living inside them. So now, when divine restraint begins lifting, that atmosphere intensifies inside their own circle. The liar no longer knows whom to trust. The manipulator is suddenly surrounded by manipulation. The accuser now feels accused. The one who thrived on hidden agendas becomes trapped in a world where everyone else also has one. This is not coincidence. This is return. And it is one of the most sobering realities of spiritual warfare. What people weaponize against the chosen often becomes the prison they must eventually live inside. That prison may not have walls at first. It may look like anxiety, confusion, relational collapse, emotional instability, public contradiction, or sudden distrust among allies. But it is still a prison because they can no longer escape the atmosphere they helped create. The chaos you are beginning to witness is the harvest of energy they thought they could control. And this is why you must not absorb guilt when their world begins unraveling. You did not create that harvest. You did not invent that spirit. You did not force them into agreement with darkness. They chose their field, and now they are living in its weather. Your role is not to celebrate cruelty, but to understand justice. Justice is not always loud punishment falling from the sky. Sometimes it is God simply allowing people to fully experience the spirit they insisted on releasing into the lives of others. For the chosen one, this becomes a profound lesson in both discernment and restraint. You begin to understand why you were told to stay clean, why you were warned not to retaliate in the same spirit, why bitterness would have been more dangerous to you than the attack itself. Had you joined them in their energy, you would have shared in their atmosphere, but God preserved you from that. He kept calling you back to truth, back to stillness, back to integrity, back to a higher way of responding, because He knew the field would eventually reverse. He knew the war against you would collapse from within. He knew the very forces they were feeding would one day consume the false peace of their own alliance. And now that this turning has begun, your assignment is not panic, not pride, not revenge, but clarity. See what is happening, learn from it. Let it confirm that your discernment was not madness, and your endurance was not wasted. What is breaking apart around your enemies is not merely a human conflict. It is the unraveling of an atmosphere that could never sustain itself under the eye of God. And while they are being forced to breathe the very spirit they once released toward you, you are being taught something even more powerful. What remains rooted in truth may be pressured for a season, but what is rooted in corruption will eventually split itself open. And once that inward corrosion reaches the point where it can no longer be disguised as stress, misunderstanding, or unfortunate conflict, something even more serious begins to happen in the unseen realm, because heaven removes its covering from the wicked. This is one of the most sobering turns in any spiritual battle, not because God suddenly becomes cruel, but because there comes a point when mercy that was meant to lead people to repentance is repeatedly rejected, twisted, mocked, or exploited. And what remains after that is exposure. Many people do not realize how much restraint heaven extends, even over those acting in darkness. They assume their success is proof of innocence, their temporary peace is proof of wisdom, and their hidden operations are safe because no immediate consequence has interrupted them. But often what they are living under is not approval, it is restraint. It is a window. It is undeserved patience. It is God allowing time for hearts to turn, for consciences to awaken, for confessions to happen, before judgment ripens into consequence. When that window is refused long enough, the restraint begins lifting, and once it lifts, the wicked discover that much of what they called stability was never theirs to keep. Their fake peace begins cracking, because it was always borrowed from a heaven they were actively dishonoring. Their unity begins breaking, because the grace that held their contradictions together is no longer being extended in the same way. Their masks begin slipping, because when divine covering is removed, performance becomes exhausting and concealment becomes unsustainable. This is why the unraveling often appears sudden to those watching from the outside. People say they changed overnight, but they did not change overnight. They simply lost the protective delay that had been keeping their inner corruption from becoming instantly visible. This is a terrifying moment for any structure built on deception. The person who seemed composed becomes erratic. The one who managed everyone else so carefully begins losing control of themselves. The one who kept narratives polished suddenly contradicts their own story. The one who manipulated others into silence can no longer regulate what leaks out of their own camp. And what makes this so unsettling is that no external enemy is required to create the collapse. Once heaven removes its restraint, hidden corruption becomes impossible to manage from the inside. It begins surfacing through tone, timing, speech, emotional instability, miscalculation, panic, pride, and desperate attempts to regain control. The very people who once looked unbothered now begin showing signs that they are being internally shaken. That is because there is a tremendous difference between being protected by truth and merely being tolerated by mercy. When truth protects you, it strengthens you under pressure. When mercy merely tolerates you, it gives you time you do not deserve. But that time is not permanent, and if it is wasted, the collapse becomes part of the teaching. This is why you must understand what you are witnessing. The disorder breaking out among those who targeted you is not only emotional fallout, it is spiritual permission being withdrawn. It is heaven saying the season of hidden coordination has ended. The masks are no longer authorized, the alliances are no longer shielded, and the false peace that sat on top of corruption is no longer allowed to remain intact. This is why everything that follows feels so dramatic, because once restraint is removed, the very people who once protected each other's secrets begin turning into the instruments of each other's destruction. They start exposing one another, And this is where the reversal becomes almost surgical in its precision. Former allies become each other's greatest threat. Conversations that were meant to stay buried begin surfacing. Private messages become evidence. Hidden comments resurface in unexpected places. Things said in confidence are repeated in anger. Blame begins spreading like fire through dry grass, because no one inside that alliance wants to be the one left carrying the full weight of the collapse. So each person starts trying to save themselves by sacrificing someone else. This is one of the deepest ironies of darkness. People who join together through deceit eventually discover that deceit cannot protect loyalty. It can only simulate it until fear enters the room. And once fear enters, self-preservation takes over. The one who once defended the group now begins distancing from it. The one who helped orchestrate confusion now claims they were misled. The one who amplified false narratives now starts implying someone else was the real source. Buried offences that had been ignored in the interest of unity now rise to the surface with sharp detail. Old resentment returns with fresh language. The offence someone swallowed 6 months ago becomes the weapon they use today. The insult they overlooked while the mission felt profitable becomes unforgivable once the alliance weakens. This is why former allies become so dangerous to one another. They know where the bodies are buried. They know what was said, who initiated what, who crossed which lines, who lied first, who benefited most, who pretended reluctance while secretly enjoying the attack. They have access to each other's contradictions, and when heaven allows the walls to crack, that information begins moving with brutal force. Suddenly the hidden camp becomes a hall of mirrors, where everyone sees reflected back the very tactics they once used against you. They begin experiencing what it feels like to be watched with suspicion, talked about without mercy, misrepresented by partial truths, trapped in narratives they can no longer control. The energy they weaponized toward you becomes their daily climate toward each other. That is why this stage often escalates quickly. Exposure accelerates when people who once colluded begin defending themselves against one another. A careless sentence becomes a confession, a defensive statement becomes an admission, an attempt to discredit someone else becomes a revelation of the whole structure. This is not random chaos, it is harvest. And the more you understand that, the more you realize why God kept you from fighting them in their own language. Had you descended into the same spirit, you would have become tangled in the same collapse. But because you were preserved in another atmosphere, you can now watch the truth do what your retaliation never could have accomplished cleanly. And that leads directly into your assignment in this hour, because the chosen one must stay silent and watch. This is not the silence of weakness, fear, or passivity. It is the silence of discipline. It is the silence of someone who has finally learned that not every battle is won by speaking first, reacting fast, or proving innocence to people committed to distortion. Sometimes the greatest form of power is to remain anchored while God allows the field to expose itself. That kind of silence is difficult because it offends the flesh. Your human instincts may want to correct the record, defend your heart, bring receipts, call names, make sure everyone knows exactly what happened and exactly who did what. And there are moments in life when speaking is necessary, but in a divine unraveling, premature speech can interrupt a revelation that is still deepening. God is asking you to stay spiritually grounded, because when corruption is collapsing under its own weight, it does not need your emotion added to the scene. It needs your restraint. It needs your trust. It needs your refusal to contaminate the vindication by turning it into revenge. This is where many chosen ones are tested in the final stages of warfare. They survived the attack, but can they survive the temptation to interfere with the collapse? Can they resist inserting themselves into a process heaven has already taken over? Can they bear the discomfort of being misunderstood for a little longer, while truth continues rising on its own schedule? Silence in this moment is not doing nothing. Silence is making a spiritual choice. It is refusing to step out of alignment just because the tide is finally turning. It is remaining so rooted in God that you no longer need the satisfaction of immediate explanation. You understand that divine justice is not only about outcomes, it is also about atmosphere. God does not merely want to rescue you from what they did. He wants to preserve who you are while He does it. He wants your hands clean when the dust settles. He wants your spirit free from the residue of hatred. He wants you able to enter the next season without carrying the vibration of the war into the promised place. That is why silence is power here. Your stillness becomes a form of testimony. Your refusal to chase their downfall proves that you were never driven by the same energies that drove them. Your calm becomes evidence that you know who is really managing the situation. And that calm is not denial, it is confidence. It is the mature understanding that when God is closing a case, the chosen do not need to slam the gavel. They need to hold their position. They need to pray without panic, observe without obsession, and stay inwardly protected while the unraveling runs its course. Because once you remain silent long enough for heaven to finish what it started, the next stage becomes impossible to hide. Their collapse becomes public. What began in whispers enters visibility. What started in secret tension becomes obvious disorder. The reputations they curated begin to crack. The alliances they relied on begin to fail in ways other people can finally see. Their influence weakens because people who once admired their confidence start sensing instability, inconsistency, contradiction, and hidden rot. This is the terrifying part for those who built themselves through image, because public collapse does not always arrive with one giant scandal. Sometimes it arrives through a series of fractures that slowly remove the illusion of authority. People begin noticing what they missed before. The tone shifts, the energy changes, stories stop lining up, relationships go cold, support withdraws, trust erodes, their words lose weight, their decisions look desperate, their control mechanisms stop working, and what they tried so hard to keep buried can no longer remain underground. Because once a structure is no longer protected by secrecy, even small cracks let light in. The very people who once helped preserve the illusion may start stepping back. Observers who were neutral begin sensing something is wrong. Those who once believed the false narrative about you begin reconsidering it because the behavior now visible from your enemies no longer supports the image they tried to project. This is what public collapse often looks like in divine reversal. It is not always loud at first, but it is undeniable over time. It is the loss of credibility, the loss of agreement, the loss of effortless influence, the loss of the unseen network that used to reinforce their version of events. And as their public stability weakens, another miracle quietly unfolds for you, because what they meant for your destruction begins creating your vindication. This is one of God's most astonishing reversals. The same attack meant to isolate you becomes evidence that you were protected. The same narrative meant to discredit you begins collapsing under the behavior of those who spread it. The same pressure meant to exhaust you becomes proof of your endurance. What they intended as your reduction becomes confirmation of your calling. Suddenly people start seeing what they missed before. Your silence no longer looks like guilt, it looks like strength. Your separation no longer looks like rejection, it looks like preservation. Your delay no longer looks like failure, it looks like divine timing. This is why vindication often feels different from what the wounded heart originally imagined. You may have once thought vindication meant everyone apologizing perfectly, every lie publicly corrected, every name cleared with dramatic precision. Sometimes God does allow moments like that, but often his vindication is more profound. He simply arranges reality so that the truth becomes self-evident. The contrast becomes clear enough that you no longer need to argue your innocence. The fruit speaks. The patterns speak. The collapse of their system speaks. And in that speaking, your name begins quietly rising in a different light. People who doubted you start re-evaluating. People who misread you begin realizing there was more going on than they understood. Doors that closed under suspicion begin reopening under discernment. What they meant to use as a stain becomes the very backdrop against which your integrity is seen more clearly. This is why you had to endure without becoming corrupt. Vindication is strongest when the vessel being vindicated remained clean enough to receive it. Had you retaliated recklessly, joined the gossip, or tried to destroy them in the same spirit, the contrast would have been blurred. But because God kept drawing you back to restraint, He preserved the evidence of who you truly were. Now their confusion clears your name. Their contradiction confirms your consistency. Their collapse validates the discernment that once made you feel alone. This is not merely about them falling. It is about you being positioned. It is about heaven using the very war sent against you to reveal that you belonged to another order all along. And once that revelation is secure, God finishes what they started. This is the final closure that makes the whole battle make sense. What began as warfare ends as testimony, because the trap does not remain hanging in the air forever. It closes on those who designed it. The very mechanisms they built to ensnare you become the pathways through which they confront the consequences of their own choices. The lie circles back. The sabotage collapses inward. The manipulation loses oxygen. The network of confusion tears at its own seams. And while all of this is happening, you find yourself doing something you may not have believed possible during the worst of it. Walking forward, untouched, in the deepest places of your identity. Not untouched in the sense that nothing hurt. It hurt. It cost you sleep, trust, peace, time, and emotional energy. But untouched where it matters most, in your calling, your essence, your bond with God, your future, your authority. They could not steal what heaven sealed. They could not cancel what God authored. They could not bury what was appointed to rise. This is what divine closure looks like. Not merely the ending of conflict, but the restoration of order. Not merely the exposure of enemies, but the confirmation of destiny. Not merely surviving the plot, but becoming wiser and stronger because of it. There is a certain authority that can only be formed after a person has been hunted by misunderstanding and still refuses to become false. There is a certain peace that only exists on the other side of realized vindication, when you no longer need everyone to understand, because you have watched God settle matters in ways human strategy never could. And there is a certain maturity that enters your spirit when you finally grasp that some of the darkest seasons of your life were not signs that you were losing, they were signs that separation was taking place. Which is why the conclusion of this whole matter is not simply that your enemies are turning on each other. The deeper truth is that you were never losing, you were being separated. Separated from lies that could not go with you. Separated from relationships built on hidden hostility. Separated from environments that fed off confusion. Separated from false loyalty, counterfeit agreement, shallow approval, and every attachment that would have sabotaged the next season of your life if it had remained intact. During the attack, it felt like abandonment. It felt like too much silence, too much delay, too much pressure, too many hidden forces operating without consequence. But now you can begin to see what heaven was doing underneath it all. God was separating truth from performance, loyalty from usefulness, discernment from paranoia, calling from distraction, and destiny from all the hands that wanted to shape it into something smaller. The reason the enemies are now turning on each other is because heaven has decided the war is over. The season of hidden operations has expired. The season of exposed corruption has begun. And while chaos now surrounds those who tried to stop you, a different atmosphere is forming around you altogether. Not the atmosphere of fear, not the atmosphere of reaction, but the atmosphere of release. The atmosphere of clarity, the atmosphere of forward movement without the weight of hidden opposition constantly clinging to your ankles. This is what you must receive now. You do not need to live in combat mode forever. You do not need to keep rehearsing the war after God has already moved to close it. You do not need to wear hypervigilance as your identity. You can let Him teach you how to step into a season where peace is no longer fragile, where discernment is no longer desperate, and where your future is no longer defined by what tried to stop it. Let the chaos stay with those who cultivated it. Let the confusion remain with those who fed it. Let the collapse educate those who built on deception. But you, chosen one, keep moving. Keep your spirit clear. Keep your heart guarded and soft in the right ways. Keep your eyes on the God who saw the whole battle before it started and still called you forward. Because what looked like warfare was also filtration. What looked like attack was also uncovering. What looked like loss was also separation. And now that the separation is complete, you are not stepping into some small recovery. You are stepping into the next stretch of your destiny, with proof written all over your life that what God protects may be pressured for a season, but it cannot be permanently overthrown.